What's My Line? Now, let's meet our award-winning What's My Line panel. First, the popular columnist whose voice of Broadway appears in the New York Journal-American and papers coast to coast, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
Dorothy Kilgallen, sharp-witted TV personality and skillful journalist. From the 1930s to the 60s, Kilgallen was one of the most powerful women in print. With a single mention, the cunning columnist could make or break a career.
She was a wonderful writer, wonderful reporter.
Dorothy, stop the presses, tear out the front page. Have I got a story for you?
Is it bigger than a bread box?
If you got on her bad side, she'd let you have it.
This is Milton Berle.
Oh, there's a product involved.
Product?
Corn.
Dorothy was, despite the controversy that swirls around her, a very bright and very good reporter of criminal cases, one of the best ever.
Kilgallen was proof positive that the pen is mightier than the sword, and in this case, just as deadly.
I called Dorothy up and I said, gee, you know, instead of the 6 million readers that you're titillating with these items, you ought to think about the person once in a while. She said, well, I wish somebody would think about me once in a while.
On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll examine the many faces of hard-nosed reporter Dorothy Kilgallen.
She was this white-gloved Catholic, and suddenly she was making out with a homosexual all over town.
We'll also uncover how Dorothy's fascination with the JFK assassination put her on a collision course with danger.
She had stumbled across something really big.
And finally, we'll explore the theories behind Kilgallen's unusual undoing.
She did know too much. Her death is very mysterious.
I mean, if they killed the president, they're not going to worry about a Broadway columnist like Dorothy Kilgallen, right?
Lock your doors and pull the shades. This story has conspiracy written all over it. Did the murder of an American president figure in the death of Dorothy Kilgallen? November 1963. The country was thrown into turmoil when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Lee Harvey Oswald was accused of the killing. Then Oswald was shot dead by Jack Ruby. Entered Dorothy Kilgallen, star reporter and columnist for New York's Journal-American. The inquisitive journalist landed a secret interview with Ruby during his incarceration in Dallas. The following March, Kilgallen wrote in her column, "The point in this historic case is that the whole truth has not been told." Biographer Johnny Whiteside.
She was interviewing all sorts of people really deep into the case and running just series after series of stories in the New York Journal-American that were asking a lot of seemingly unanswerable questions.
Doug Mensch is the author of The Big Book of Conspiracies.
The more she found out about the Warren investigation and witnesses being threatened into silence, the more suspicious she became. She started saying, this has to be a conspiracy.
But before Dorothy had a chance to publish her findings, the 52-year-old writer was found dead in her New York City townhouse. How she wound up that way is anyone's guess.
I think it's highly suspicious that Dorothy dies after saying she's going to bust this case wide open and have the scoop of the century, the biggest story of all time.
But we'll get into Kilgallen's puzzling final exit a little later on in the show. First, let's take this story back to the beginning. July 3rd, 1913, the day Dorothy Kilgallen was born in New York City. Oscar-nominated filmmaker Gene Bach was a close friend of Dorothy's.
Mr. Kilgallen was a prominent reporter for the Hearst paper. She was sort of the apple of Mr. Kilgallen's eye, and he was instrumental in getting her first newspaper assignment, which was spectacular.
In 1931, 17-year-old Dorothy dropped out of college to work as a cub reporter for the New York Evening Journal, but it wasn't until 1936 that the ambitious writer catapulted into national stardom. Kilgallen biographer Lee Israel.
Her first big break was her participation in a race around the world in 38 days, and in each of those days Dorothy had her picture. She was in the headlines. So when Dorothy came back, Dorothy was famous.
Kilgallen's friend, music producer Marlon Swing.
She developed her own style and forcefully went into this man's world. There were a few
quote sob sisters writing columns. But her main reportage was crime and heavy-duty investigation.
In 1938, Dorothy got her own byline, but instead of the crime beat, Kilgallen covered Broadway for the Journal-American.
And then they gave her this column, which started out locally and then became nationwide, called The Voice of Broadway. Mainly it dealt with theatrical people in New York.
Like cabaret entertainer Bobby Short.
She was tremendously powerful. People would kill to be in the column. And newspapers were everything in those days.
Dorothy wrote everything from backstage gossip to royal coronations in her column. In 1940, Kilgallen married a young actor named Dick Colmar. The couple soon hit the radio waves when their daily chat show, Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, premiered in 1945.
They were the original Mr. and Mrs. radio show, and they broadcast from their house in their night clothes.
Syndicated columnist Liz Smith.
She was out every night in New York with her husband, Dick Calmer, and people would listen to Dorothy and Dick out of irritation, I think, more than being charmed by it.
But there was no doubt about Dorothy's charm when she began appearing as a regular panelist on a new TV quiz show called What's My Line in 1950.
What's My Line?
Mr. Steve Allen.
They wanted somebody like a Dorothy Kilgallen because she was kind of acerbic and sarcastic. It was her job on the panel of What's My Line to ask sort of sometimes impertinent questions. She probably guessed what people's line was, what their job was, more often than anyone on the panel.
That makes it 5 down and 5 to go. With Kilgallen.
Do you have anything to do with the numbers coming up on the scoreboard every time the Dodgers get a home run?
Actually, I think you hit it right on the head.
When Dorothy was on What's My Line, she played to win the game. On one hand, she was able to make shows, make entertainers, or kill them. And on the other hand, she was this little girl playing games.
But Dorothy Kilgallen was no little girl, and the game she was playing would soon turn deadly. When we come back, Dorothy's sharp tongue wins her one very prominent enemy.
Are you an adorable gentleman who is noted for one particular feature?
Yes. Jimmy Durante.
By 1954, 41-year-old Dorothy Kilgallen was at the top of her game. Her daily radio show, gossip column, and regular stint on the hit TV quiz show What's My Line made Kilgallen a household name. But crime reporting always remained Dorothy's first love.
The first case that she covered seriously, for which she continues to be known, is the Sam Shepard murder case in Ohio in 1954. She put everything on hold and went to Cleveland to cover the trial.
Dr. Sam Shepard was tried for the gruesome stabbing murder of his wife, Marilyn. Famed attorney F. Lee Bailey represented Shepard in his appeal.
Dorothy was, despite the controversy that swirls around her, a very bright and very good reporter of criminal cases, one of the best ever. And she said, this is the trial of the century. It's a great mystery.
Kilgallen was convinced that the good doctor was clean. Too bad for Shepard, Dorothy wasn't on the jury.
I don't think she could think of a motive that satisfied her. She was sure that he was innocent, and she was sure that the jury would agree with her, alas, they finally did not.
Shepard was thrown in the clink. The well-publicized case became the inspiration for the TV series The Fugitive. 10 years after the conviction, F. Lee Bailey enlisted Dorothy to testify on Shepard's behalf.
She got up and said, well, I want to tell you something. He never got a fair trial because when the trial was beginning, Judge Edward Blythen called me into his chambers, and he said, he's guilty as hell. She said, I've always been convinced that this guy was wrongfully convicted, and I've got to tell you, the trial was a circus, because I was there. It was awful.
Guilty of murder in the second degree.
The U.S. Supreme Court really turned that case over on the trial judge's misconduct, and she was an important part of that. Sam was retried and acquitted.
Score one for Dorothy. In 1999, DNA evidence further proves Shepard's innocence. But let's not get off the track here. Back in 1954, Kilgallen was living the high life she'd always dreamed of.
In addition to her television appearances on What's My Line in the column, for throwing marvelous parties in New York in the glamour early 50s days, And Jane and I were honored to be invited. As the old saying goes, everybody who was anybody was at her parties.
But not everybody. See, in her column, Dorothy began to openly badmouth Frank Sinatra about his playboy lifestyle. Old Blue Eyes didn't take too kindly to the cracks.
And that's what started a rivalry between them. And it became an obsession with Frank. So on the stage, he would, for no reason at all, break a set of tunes and start talking about Dorothy Kilgallen. And he coined the phrase chinless wonder.
She wasn't pretty. I mean, she didn't have any chin, and this was the big thing that Frank Sinatra attacked her and called her the chinless wonder and all that. These things hurt her feelings terribly.
I'd like to say some nice words about Dorothy Kilgallen for about 5 minutes. I'd met many, many male finks, but I never met a female fink until I met Dorothy Kilgallen. How's that for an opener?
Seems Dorothy could dish it out, but she couldn't take it. Kilgallen was always insecure about her looks, and her philandering husband Dick didn't help Dorothy's confidence much either.
Well, that marriage was always a little fishy, most people felt, because Dick had a roving eye. So here was Dick, getting drunk and squeezing somebody on the dance floor, and Dorothy just acted as though it never happened.
One of the controversies of Dorothy Kilgallen's life, aside from the fact that a lot of people hated her because they thought her column was kind of bitchy, she had this love affair with the singer Johnny Ray, and almost everybody assumed or knew that Johnny Ray was gay.
Okay, now that would present a problem. Still, dating a popular columnist helped Ray's career, and Dorothy just liked the attention. Gene Bach remembers meeting the singer.
I said, listen, I'm going to a party for Dorothy Kilgallen, who you're a great admirer. Could I get something that you write on, and I'll take it to her? So he gave her his underwear shorts, and he said, Dorothy, lots of love from my bottom, or something. I mean, he was so fresh.
So Dick finally blew up and put his foot down. He threatened to kill Johnny. He threw him out of their house and told Dorothy that she was never to see him again. Johnny was scared, and he wouldn't take Dorothy's calls. She was frantic, and she fell apart to the point where she was hospitalized.
Johnny would have to die before she could stop loving him, and that was pretty strong. So she had no intention of giving him up.
But Kilgallen's failing love life would soon take a back seat to history. Up next, Detective Dorothy lands hot on the trail of cold-blooded assassins. By mid-1963, 50-year-old journalist Dorothy Kilgallen was in a slump. Her marriage to actor Dick Colmar was falling apart. The couple's long-running radio show got yanked, and Dorothy's syndicated gossip column was losing steam. On top of all that, Kilgallen's peculiar affair with gay singer Johnny Ray was history. But on November 22nd, Dorothy was shaken from her blues when President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas by alleged lone assassin Lee Harvey Oswald.
Dorothy, like everybody in the nation, was shocked, and it was a terrible, terrible national trauma.
Not to mention a very perplexing crime. Early in 1964, the U.S. government appointed a group, the Warren Commission, to investigate the murder. Dorothy, in the meantime, donned her detective cap and began to sniff around.
Alone amongst the mainstream press reporters, Dorothy began harboring suspicions that the so-called open and shut case against Lee Harvey Oswald was not so open and shut.
Dorothy was finding dissident witnesses, deposing them, publishing their testimony. She was going to Dallas. She was threatening to publish finally, and saying it would be the biggest story of her life.
Dorothy somehow obtained the Warren Commission report testimony given by Jack Ruby while he was in prison, while it was still classified top secret.
For you folks who don't remember, Jack Ruby is the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald on national television 2 days after Oswald bumped off the president. Soon, Dorothy's digging caught the attention of more than just her loyal readers.
She had found, I think, several hundred discrepancies in the Warren Commission report. All our phones were tapped because they were trying to figure out how she had gotten that.
She said she was going to blow the JFK assassination case wide open and have the scoop of the century. She was able to obtain the first interview with Jack Ruby in prison and the only interview with Jack Ruby where the reporter was alone with him in an unbugged room, where, in other words, where Ruby felt free to talk.
I know that she could have gotten a lot out of Jack Ruby because she had that technique. She gave hints that something was coming up, that she had stumbled on to something.
She would say, I'm going to New Orleans. I got to meet a man there. It's all very cloak and daggerish.
I wondered a lot about this so-called folder that she had. She brought it into the dressing room at What's My Line and said, here's all the stuff that I've learned, and I'm working on it. Nobody can have a look at it.
In the summer of 1965, Dorothy was suddenly swept off her feet by a shady out-of-towner.
This person I referred to as the new man in her life. His suddenly romancing her and his sudden interest in her was prompted by somebody, not necessarily himself, but prompted by some faction.
Now let's just suppose that Dorothy really had stumbled onto something big. Let's just say that she was about to prove there was a conspiracy in the JFK assassination. What do you think the odds are that somebody would want to shut her up? Dorothy may have been getting closer to the truth, but she was also getting closer to her own demise. Straight ahead, curiosity kills the cat. In 1965, journalist Dorothy Kilgallen was convinced there was a deliberate plot behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When it came to criminal investigations, Kilgallen's track record was pretty good. She was on target in the Sam Shepard murder case back in 1954, and Dorothy was positive she uncovered evidence to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone in the shooting of JFK.
Through her research and the interview with Jack Ruby and the other witnesses that she had contacted, she was convinced that it was conspiracy.
Kilgallen was racing to finish a book about the assassination titled Murder One. She was also in love again, this time with a mystery man from out of town.
She was involved with this newspaper man from Ohio, and that made her terribly happy.
Jean Bach's husband, Bob Bach, had a couple of cocktails with Dorothy on the night of November 7th, 1965.
I knew she'd had the drinks with Bob. They'd been at Clark's. I think she said, just drop me off at the Regency. So she was having a late date that night.
She was seen again at the Regency Hotel, which was said to have been the trysting place of herself and the out-of-towner. She disappeared into the reddish dark of the Regency Lounge, and that was the last time anybody who would admit to seeing Dorothy saw her that night.
The next morning, the body of Dorothy Kilgallen was discovered in her Upper East Side townhouse. The official cause of death was later determined to be acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication, circumstances undetermined. In other words, she died from too much pills and liquor.
She was found dead in her bed with a book called The Honey Badger by Robert Ruark next to her open. She could not read without her reading glasses, and they were all the way across the room, far out of reach. A number of other people, including the medical examiner and the police detective, have made statements or allegations that the death seemed staged.
And get this, without much poking around, the cops came to the immediate decision that Kilgallen's death was an accident. Dorothy was known to throw back a few drinks. Combine the alcohol with too many sleeping pills, and there you have it, case closed. But a more in-depth look at the facts reveals something interesting.
Dorothy was not a smoker, and the medical examiner's report showed an inordinate amount of nicotine in her.
What disturbs me is that there was absolutely nada investigation of her death at the time. The head of toxicology at the time had a beaker of extract from Dorothy's brain and stomach. It was kept virtually on ice.
13 years after Kilgallen's death, the beaker was still on ice. That is, until biographer Lee Israel did some digging of her own and had the extract analyzed.
Substance from her stomach bespoke the presence of 3 different kinds of slow-acting sleeping pills, which is exactly what you would do, I suppose, if you were a kiss-and-kill kind of guy who was dispatched by the CIA or by whomever.
A kiss-and-kill kind of guy like, say, the mysterious out-of-towner?
If enough people believed that she had the scoop on what really happened, that would probably impel them into some violent action. So who knows? She
had notes and notes and notes about it, which after her death disappeared.
The file was supposedly very thick. It was suspected that it was either stolen or her husband had it and may have destroyed it. Her husband, Richard Colmar, the actor-producer, was asked what was in Dorothy's file. He said, "I'm afraid that's a secret that will have to go to the grave with me."
And so it did. Colmar committed suicide in 1971. Nobody ever found out the truth about Dorothy's death or about what Jack Ruby told her in prison. All loose ends in a much bigger plot. Dorothy Kilgallen will probably be remembered as the quizzical pundit on What's My Line? But who knows? If her findings in the JFK assassination were ever published, this might be a different story altogether. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we unravel the riddles on Mysteries and Scandals.
That's 1 down and 9 to go, Miss Kilgallen.
Do your services pertain to both men and women?
Yes.
Do you do mental type work?
Yes.
Is your work more mental than physical?
Yes.
Do you need a special training for your job?
Yes.
Do you work indoors?
Yes.
Do people come to you?
Sometimes.
And sometimes you go to them?
Sometimes.
Do you ever have occasion to touch them?
No.